Goldie, and I'm back with another video. So if you are a legal eagle like me, you are just totally consumed with Diddy's trial. As you know, it kicked off on Monday, May 12th, just a few days ago, and things have been really heating up. So I have wanted to compile some general information about the trial and begin to report as often, hopefully every single day, about all of the goings on taking place in this trial. So far, so much has been going on, and there's really a lot to talk about. But let's get started on laying the foundation of this trial and kind of what we can expect to have going on. Now, Diddy has been charged with 3 specific crimes: 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison; 1 count of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison and a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison; and 1 count of transportation for the purpose of prostitution, which carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Now let's get into a little bit about what these crimes are. Racketeering is a set of illegal activities aimed at commercial profit that may be disguised as legitimate business deals. Racketeering is defined by a coordinated effort by multiple people to repeatedly earn a profit, typically by fraud, extortion, or bribery, threats of violence, or other illegal means. Now, this one is a big one. This is the RICO case that you hear a lot of people talking about. The thing that you need to pay attention to when listening to the evidence in this case is if it is a group effort, if it has taken him a group effort to enact these crimes, and if it was an organized group effort. If he was the leader of an organized group effort, then you meet the standard for him having committed a RICO act or a RICO violation. Next up, we have sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking which transports or exploits persons to use them for sexual acts. The U.S. Code defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. That section defines a commercial sex act as any sex act on account of which anything of value is given or received by any person. Next is the transportation for the purposes of prostitution. So whoever knowingly transport any individual in interstate or foreign commerce or in any territory or possession of the United States with intent that such individual engage in prostitution or any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense or attempts to do so shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 10 years or both. Now that we know a little bit about the charges, let's talk about the key players in this trial. We have Judge Arun Subramanian. Now, he's been on the federal bench for about 2 years. He was appointed by President Joe Biden. Diddy's lead attorneys are no strangers to high-profile cases. We have Mark Anthony Agnofilio, who has defended a sex cult leader, as well as a Goldman Sachs banker, and even someone from the former International Monetary Fund, and that would be Dominique Strauss-Kahn. We also have joining him a partner in his firm, and that's Teeny Garagos. She has a really high-profile father, Mark Garagos, and he has defended artists like Michael Jackson and Chris Brown. Now, for the other attorneys that we'll have working with Diddy, we have Alexandra Shapiro. I believe she's related to one of OJ's, one of the Dream Team lawyers. And then we have Brian Steele, who has recently represented Young Thug, and that was the longest running criminal trial that has taken place in Georgia. For the prosecution side, they have 8 lawyers working for the federal government. 5 of them are women. Now, this is really something to think about. The prosecution for the federal prosecution side has a lot of strong women that are prosecuting this case. We have Emily Ann Johnson, Madison Reddick, Smizer, Mary Christine Slavic, Meredith Foster, Mitzi Steiner. And then we also have Maureen Ryan Comey, who is the daughter of former FBI Director James Comey. Now I want to take a little bit of time to kind of go through the process of a trial, a federal trial, and talk about how this trial will work. This is Sean Diddy Combs, of course, federal trial which is now underway. The federal criminal trial for Sean Diddy Combs has begun in New York, where the music mogul faces charges that include racketeering, conspiracy, transportation to engage in prostitution, and sex trafficking, and those are crimes that the government claims have spanned over 2 decades. Combs has pleaded not guilty and denied all allegations of wrongdoing. The trial is estimated to last 8 weeks before the jury will be asked to render a verdict. As a primer for how this may unfold, I got this from CNN, and they compiled the steps of a criminal trial. So, number 1 would be jury call. In the Combs case, questionnaires were distributed to hundreds of prospective jurors in late April. The answers were reviewed by the parties for anyone who could not serve on the case for a variety of reasons, such as financial hardships or if they could not be fair. Those who were not cut from the batch received a notice to report to federal court for jury duty beginning May 5th, 2025. Number 2, voir dire. The judge questions potential jurors about their backgrounds and beliefs on topics related to the case and what, if anything, they heard about the allegations to determine whether they can be fair and impartial jurors. Prospective jurors can be struck for cause, which is when the judge determines there's a legitimate reason they cannot serve on a jury. The attorneys for each side of the case get peremptory strikes they can use to dismiss potential jurors they don't want on the panel without providing a reason. Number 3, jurors sworn in. Once the jurors and alternates are selected, they take an oath pledging to follow the judge's instructions on the law and decide the case solely on the evidence presented during the trial. The judge also instructs them to not listen to media accounts of the trial or discuss the case with anyone, including jurors, until deliberations begin. Number 4, opening statements. Attorneys for the prosecution and defense map out their theories in the case and charges. Previewing trial evidence, they say the jury will see through witness testimony and exhibits. The prosecutors will give the first opening statement. The attorney's opening statements are not considered evidence for jurors to consider. Now, we are here, and this is the presentation of the prosecution's case. Now, prosecutors go first because they have the burden of proof. They present trial evidence through witness testimony and exhibits. Defense attorneys can cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses and typically aim to discredit their testimony. Witnesses' responses are considered evidence, but not the questions posed by an attorney. Number 6, defendant's case. A criminal defendant is not required to present a defense, though Combs' team is expected to call several witnesses. The defendant is not required to testify at trial, as all criminal defendants have a right to remain silent and decline to testify in their own defense. The jury is instructed to not read into a defendant's choice to not testify. Number 7, prosecution's rebuttal case. Prosecutors can present additional evidence specifically tailored to respond to the defense case. The prosecution is not required to present any rebuttal evidence. Number 8, closing arguments. Attorneys for the prosecution and defense each give a closing argument appealing to the jury that will soon consider the case. In federal court, prosecutors present their closing arguments first, followed by the defense team. Prosecutors are allowed the final say and can respond in a rebuttal closing argument since they need to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Number 9, jury instruction or jury charge. The judge instructs the jury as to the charges they must consider against the defendant and the laws governing their deliberations. Number 10, jury deliberation. A panel of 12 jurors considers the evidence presented at trial and charges against the defendant. The jury receives a copy of all of the evidence admitted at trial and can ask to hear witness testimony read back to them. The jury can communicate with the court and ask questions about the case with the court through handwritten notes. When the jury poses a question, the parties gather to determine how best to respond. Alternate jurors may be dismissed at the start of deliberations or remain under oath and sequestered in case they are needed to replace a juror in the main panel. If an alternate juror is called upon to take a seat of a juror, then deliberations have to start from the beginning. If the jury communicates that the panel is deadlocked during deliberations, the judge can order them to continue working toward a unanimous verdict at least once. The jury must be unanimous in its decision. Number 11, verdict. The jury will notify the court that they've reached a verdict. The verdict will then be read in court. All jurors will be polled to confirm the verdict read in court reflects their own vote. Ultimately, the judge can declare a mistrial if a verdict is not reached, also known as a hung jury. And lastly, number 12, sentencing. If or when the jury reaches a guilty verdict, the judge sentences the defendant, typically during a sentencing hearing at a later date. Now let's get into a reading of the opening statements of both the defense and the prosecution. This is important to listen to and pay attention to because you can take the testimony of the witnesses and see if the criteria for the charges have been met, and to really kind of get an understanding of where the trial is going and kind of who is winning and who is losing. So let's go ahead and get into these opening statements. This is the opening statement for the prosecution, performed by Assistant United States Attorney Emily Johnson. This is Sean Combs. To the public, he was Puff Daddy, or Diddy, a cultural icon, a businessman larger than life. But there's another side to him, a side that ran a criminal enterprise. During this trial, you're going to hear about 20 years of the defendant's crimes, but he didn't do it alone. He had help. He had an inner circle of bodyguards and high-ranking employees who helped him commit crimes and helped him cover them up. Kidnapping, arson, drugs, sex crimes, bribery, obstruction. These are just some of the crimes that the defendant and his inner circle committed again and again. You're going to hear about all of them during this trial. But let's start now with just one night. The defendant was on the hunt for his girlfriend, a woman named Cassie. For years, the defendant physically abused Cassie. He also sexually exploited her, forcing her to have sex with male escorts while he watched and recorded it. But that night, the defendant learned he had lost control of Cassie. He found out Cassie was seeing another man. Furious, he set out to find Cassie and the other man, but he couldn't do it by himself. So he took his gun and he took his bodyguard, one of his most loyal lieutenants, to wake up one of the defendant's employees in the middle of the night. The defendant yelled that he was going to kill the man that Cassie was with. He demanded that his employees take him to the man's house. And the defendant forced the employee out of her apartment and into an SUV. They drove to the house. The defendant and his bodyguard broke in, but no one was there. He kept looking for her. Cassie, when he finally found her, he did what he had done countless times before. He beat her. Violence wasn't enough, though. The defendant had to make sure he had control over Cassie once again, so he threatened her. The defendant told Cassie that if she defied him again, that he would publicly release the videos of her having sex with male escorts that he kept as blackmail souvenirs of the most humiliating nights of her life. This was just one night in the defendant's 2 decades of crime. In one night, he and his lieutenant kidnapped an employee, broke into a man's house, and then the defendant beat and blackmailed his girlfriend. And as you will learn, this was just the tip of the iceberg. These are not the only crimes the defendant committed. That's not the only time he kidnapped someone, and Cassie is not the only woman he beat or sexually exploited. For 20 years, the defendant, with the help of his trusted inner circle, committed crime after crime, and that's why we are here today. That's what this case is about. 20 years of crimes. It's a lot to cover. So first I'm going to walk you through what the evidence in this case will show. Then I will explain a little bit about the charges. And then I will tell you how the government will prove that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So that the evidence will show. You'll learn that the defendant was a musician who created a music empire. He had a record company, a record label, Bad Boy Records, and other businesses that he ran or controlled. Those businesses made the defendant rich, and he uses his money and those companies to build a reputation to feed his every desire. To do that, he relied on the inner circle of people closest to him, like his bodyguards, chiefs of staff, and other high-ranking employees who ran all aspects of his life. Together, the group worked to promote the defendant's power. They carefully cultivated and guarded his reputation, and they worked to get the defendant everything he wanted, and sometimes called himself the king. He expected to be treated like one. He expected his inner circle to cater to every desire, including his sexual desires. For years, the defendant used his inner circle and his company's resources to sexually exploit multiple women, including women he forced and manipulated into having sex with male escorts, meaning men who the defendant paid to have sex with women while he watched. No matter what the defendant and his inner circle, they made sure that he got everything he wanted many times, involving committing crimes together and then covering those crimes up. Those crimes included violent acts like when the defendant brought his bodyguard and his gun to kidnap the employee I mentioned earlier, but you will hear of other violence too. like when the defendant's bodyguards kidnapped the same employee. Another time, forcing her to sit through days of lie detector tests, or when the defendant had a man's car set on fire, or when the defendant dangled a woman over a balcony. You'll see and hear evidence of all of this defendant's this defendant had impossible demands. When his employees failed to meet those demands, the defendant threw things at them, threatened them, hit them, and pressured them to take drugs. He even sexually assaulted one of them. You'll also hear how the defendant used his employees to get and distribute drugs. They delivered those drugs wherever the defendant asked, including so he could give those same drugs to women he was forcing to have sex with the male escorts. He transported those women and those escorts across state lines, even out of the country, for those sex acts. And he used his inner circle and vast resources of his business empire, to help arrange those trips and make the women available to him. Let me be very clear on this next point. This case is not about a celebrity's private sexual preferences. The evidence will show the sexual conduct at the issue of this case was coercive and criminal because the defendant made women have sex they did not want to, because he threatened them, he drugged, and he helped. He drugged, he lied to them, and he even used violence to make them do it. Okay, a lot of this trial will focus some of the details on just two women, Cassie, who I talked about earlier, and Jane. Some of the details of what happened to Cassie and Jane may be hard to hear, but this is what the evidence will show happened. The defendant used lies, drugs, threats, and violence to force and coerce first Cassie and then later Jane to have sex with him in front of male escorts. The defendant insisted that sex occur in a very, very specific and highly orchestrated way. These sexual performances lasted multiple days, and they involve multiple escorts. The defendants called these encounters by different names over the years. First, freak-offs, later, wild king nights or hotel nights. Week after week, the defendant directed freak-offs in hotels across the country and sometimes out of the country. At times, the defendant had escorts and the women travel from out of state, so the defendant's staff sometimes organized flights, cars, and hotels. The defendant businesses paid those expenses. The defendant had particular demands of 4 freak-offs at his direction. The defendant's staff set up the room in advance with supplies like his preferred lighting, extra linen, lubricant, and his staff remained on call to refresh anything the defendant needed, like cash to pay the escorts or drugs for the women and the defendant. The hotel rooms were dark, and the defendant instructed Cassie and Jane how to look in lingerie, wear tall platform heels, and to have manicured white nails. The defendant selected drugs for Cassie and Jane to take, usually MDMA, also known as Molly or ecstasy. Some of those drugs made Cassie and Jane sick, but they also made the women more uninhibited and sexually aroused. The defendant fed Cassie and Jane drugs throughout the freak-off so that they could stay awake and perform for him for hours and days at a time. Once an escort arrived, the defendant dictated every step of the sexual activity that followed. Sexual activity followed the same pattern, and he expected the women to enjoy themselves. He wanted them to appear as if they enjoyed themselves. The defendant masturbated throughout the freak-offs and even video recorded parts of them. I'll tell you more that Cassie was a 19-year-old model and aspiring singer with the hit song When She Met the Defendant in 2006. The defendant was 17 years older than her and the head of his record label. Soon, Cassie was signed to a 10-album deal that the label and the defendant pursued Cassie, and within a year they were dating. They stayed together off and on until about 2018, during the time Cassie tried to work on her music and modeling and acting, but the defendant made her turn away many opportunities. Instead, he paid for Cassie's cars, her apartment, and some of her day-to-day expenses. Although Cassie recorded music constantly, the defendant, the head of her record label, had the final say in the music that she released, and it was never another album. The defendant started abusing Cassie early, and initially Cassie fought back, but time and time again the defendant hit Cassie in the head, threw her on the ground, kicked her, and dragged her by her hair. In 2009, the defendant threw Cassie to the floor of an SUV and stumped on her repeatedly, stumped on her face. To hide her injuries, the defendant forced Cassie to stay in the hotel for the next week. He refused to let her leave, and he had staff check on her to make sure she stayed put. The defendant also introduced Cassie to freak-offs early on in the relationship. Soon, the defendant made it Cassie's job to find and book escorts for freak-offs. The freak-offs that were happening as often as once a week for days at a time, meaning that almost half of every week, Cassie was in a dark hotel room, high and awake for days, performing sex acts that she did not want to do on male escorts. Cassie will tell you how she felt when she was choking when the defendant made an escort urinate in her mouth, and how she overdosed at a freak-off when she still had an open wound on her face from the defendant's most recent assault. The defendant's physical attacks on Cassie happened at freak-offs too, as you will see on video during this trial. The defendant hit and kicked Cassie in the hallway of an LA hotel, trying to drag her back to the room where they had been with an escort. We'll talk more about that video later. Cassie tried the first freak-off because she loved the defendant and wanted to make him happy. After that, she knew it was not something she wanted to do. But because of the defendant, it became almost everything she did. Because if Cassie didn't want to do it, if she didn't want to do what the defendant wanted, the consequences were severe. Physically, the defendant beat her, viciously exploiting her over even the slightest offense, and then beating her to show who was in charge. He beat her when she didn't answer the phone when he called. He beat her when she left a freak-off without his permission. He beat her when he thought she took too long in the bathroom. The defendant taught Cassie that defying him could often and would often end in violence. And when she tried to run away, he always found her, often with the help of his inner circle, and Cassie's career and livelihood were also in the defendant's hands. This is something the defendant made clear to Cassie. He told her he could destroy her career by releasing the videos that he recorded from her performing sex acts on dozens and dozens of male escorts. So Cassie knew that failing to please the defendant, refusing his demands, had more than just physical consequences. It had the power to ruin her life. The defendant's control of violence and the defendant's threat, that is how the defendant ensured Cassie could not say no to him. So time and time again, when the defendant suggested to Cassie that they have a freak-off, she knew she had no choice but to agree. And she went to work setting one up. When she texted the escorts, arranged for them to come to the hotels, and put on the performances the defendant wanted, her livelihood and her safety depended on keeping him happy. Cassie's relationship with the defendant was complicated. You'll hear during the trial that both Cassie and the defendant were unfaithful, jealous, and at times angry, but only one of them had power. Only one had control, and that was the defendant. And with that power and with that control, he made Cassie do his biddings in those dark hotel rooms. You'll learn that Cassie was not the only woman the defendant did this to. This was part of the pattern. Now I want to tell you about Jane. Jane was a single mom who started spending time with the defendant in 2020. The defendant pursued and romanced Jane, who fell in love with him quickly. Jane was not seeing other men, but the defendant was seeing other women at the time. So this was his relationship with Jane was not at all public. For the first few months, their sex life was just the two of them, and Jane was happy that she was with the defendant until the defendant introduced Jane to freak-offs. One night, when they had already taken drugs and had been having sex for hours, the defendant told Jane about freak-offs. Jane agreed to try one to make the defendant happy, but to her surprise, the defendant said that he would make it happen. Immediately, and that very same night, he took her to a hotel room that was already set up and an escort was on the way. Jane was nervous and the defendant directed her step by step. Jane thought the first freak-off was just a one-time wild night. Jane was wrong. The defendant continued to ask Jane to have freak-offs and promising that if she did, they would spend quality time together. They would go on dates together. They would go on trips. And that is what Jane wanted more than anything. A real relationship. So she agreed. She helped plan freak-offs and she reached out to the escorts. But even though the defendant promised her quality time and trips, he never delivered. Those were just lies. He told her to get her to hotel rooms in the dark with escorts. Jane will tell you about those nights and the details that she wanted. She wanted the escorts to wear condoms, but many times the defendant did not let them. And Jane will also tell you about how he had her take drugs to stay awake and aroused for days. Jane tried twice to make it through those nights without drugs. The first time she broke down and she had to take ecstasy to finish performing for the defendant. And the second time Jane vomited after having sex with one escort. How did the defendant respond? He told her to hurry up and get back to the room where the other escort was waiting. Early on, Jane told the defendant that she didn't like freak-offs and that she wanted to be alone with him and she loved him desperately and wanted a real relationship. The defendant did not listen. Feeling stuck and sick of the strangers that the defendant kept bringing to those hotel rooms, Jane tried to assert herself in a small way. She found two men who performed in pornography and she invited them to join the freak-offs. That way Jane could at least choose the other sex workers. She could choose the other men that she would be forced to be intimate with, like he did with Cassie. The defendant eventually took steps to control Jane financially. The defendant wanted Jane available to meet him, and he noticed that he discouraged her from working. Jane's income plummeted. The defendant gave Jane money and then later started paying the rent for her house that she lived in with her child. That way, when Jane resisted the freak-offs and told him over and over that she wanted to stop, he had the power to coerce her back into the hotel room. And just as he had with Cassie, the defendant threatened Jane with videos that he recorded of her engaging in sex acts with escorts. But the lies and the drugs and the threats were not the end of it. Even a year ago today, Jane had the worst day of her life. The defendant came to Jane's house for a date night. She and the defendant argued about another woman that the defendant had been seen with. Jane was upset and jealous. She had now spent years in the hotel rooms. She had now spent years in hotel rooms forced to have sex with the defendant while he took his own other girlfriends for dates and trips. Jane hit the defendant and threw things at him, and the defendant became enraged. So Jane tried to get away from him and hide. She ran to her bedroom, locked the door, but he kicked it in. He kicked it open. She ran to her bedroom and he kicked the door open. She ran to the guest bedroom and locked the door, and he again kicked the door open. She tried to run out the front door, but he grabbed her in a chokehold, lifted her off the ground by her neck, and kicked her to the ground. Later that night, they fought again, and just as he had with Cassie, the defendant viciously attacked Jane. He punched her in the face, kicked her while she was curled up in a ball on the ground, dragged her by her hair, her arm, and slapped Jane's face so hard she fell over. When all of this was over, the defendant still did not let Jane be. Instead, he told Jane, "You're not going to F up my night." The defendant instructed her to put on an outfit and call up an escort for a freak off. He made Jane cover her black eye and bruising and take an ecstasy pill and perform for the defendant with the escort that Jane had followed. She followed his instructions like with Cassie. The defendant's violence had gotten him what he wanted. The defendant's sexual violence did not stop at freak-offs, though. Cassie will tell you about the time when the defendant forced himself on her, having sex with her, as she cried and repeatedly told him no. And Mia, an employee who the defendant worked with to the bone for years, will tell you about a time that the defendant forced himself on her sexually, putting his hands up her dress, unzipping his pants, and forcing her to perform oral sex and sneaking into her bed to penetrate her against her will. As I said before, the defendant had the power and the control and endless resources and a loyal inner circle who would stop at nothing to get him what he wanted. Amidst all the violence, the defendant and his inner circle had to make sure that nothing put the defendant's public image and his power at risk, so as tirelessly as the defendant's inner circle worked to meet the defendant's every need, they also worked to cover up his crimes. Remember the video at the LA hotel of the defendant attacking Cassie during a freak-off? You will hear just how far the defendant's bodyguards and his chief of staff went to get what they thought was the only copy of that video. The defendant first tried to pay off a hotel security guard with a wad of cash in exchange for his silence. But the defendant and his chief of staff reached out to a different hotel security guard to broker a deal in exchange for the video from the hotel. The defendant gave the security guard a brown bag of $100,000 in cash while the defendant's bodyguard and his chief of staff stood by. This is far from the only time the defendant's inner circle tried to close ranks and to do damage control. You'll hear how the inner circles covered up the defendant's brutal beatings by keeping Cassie in hiding for days. You'll hear about the inner circle contacting witnesses of the defendant's abuse to feed them lies, including even after he knew about the investigation. He knew about the investigation into this case, and again, the defendant and his inner circle tried to keep the defendant's crimes out of the public view to protect his reputation and to protect his power. That is what the evidence in this case will show for all of this the defendant is charged with. He's charged with multiple federal crimes. You'll hear a lot more on the charges at the end of this trial when the judge instructs you and the law and his instructions. But for now, there are just a few points I want to highlight so that you have context for what you'll hear during this case. First, the defendant is charged with racketeering conspiracy. Based on his agreement to commit crimes as part of an enterprise, I expect the judge will tell you that an enterprise is a group of people who work together for a common purpose of engaging in conduct. A course of conduct over time, here you will learn that the enterprise is the inner circle I talk about. The bodyguard, the high ranking employees, like the chief of staff. Some of these people came and went over 20 years, but I expect the evidence will show you that the defendant has a thorough line. He remained at the top, and running that group he always had trusted bodyguards and advisors helping him. Together they agreed to commit different crimes, including kidnapping, arson, and distributing drugs to other people, exploiting employees for labor, and in Mia's case, sex, bribery, and obstruction, sex trafficking, and the transporting of people for prostitution. That's all covered by the racketeering conspiracy charge. The defendant is also charged separately for sex trafficking. Cassie and Jane, through force and fraud and coercion, and again, the judge's instructions will tell you what to control, but I expect you will learn that the fraud includes a lie about a material fact. Coercion includes threats, and force of threats includes violence. The defendant is charged with using all of these tactics to make Cassie and Jane participate in days-long drug-fueled recorded sexual encounters with male escorts against their will. Finally, he is charged with transporting Cassie and Jane and male escorts across state lines for their sexual encounters. How will the government prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of these crimes? You'll hear from witnesses, including Cassie and Jane, two of the defendant's victims. They will tell you how the defendant tried to control their lives, from their homes to their careers, to how the defendant used his control over him, his lies, his drugs, his threats, his violence, to force and coerce them into having sex with male escorts. Cassie and Jane will describe freak-offs for you in painstaking detail. They will tell you some of the most personal and painful experiences of their lives. The days they spent awake in hotel rooms, high on drugs, dressed as characters to perform the defendant's fantasies, just as he directed them to do. You'll hear from some of the defendant's employees. You'll hear from Mia, who worked with the defendant's personal assistants for years. The employee he sexually assaulted. Mia is just beginning to grapple with the times the defendant forced himself on her sexually. Mia will tell you how she could not talk about what happened to her until recently, how she wanted to take the secret of what the defendant did to her grave. You'll hear from the employees of the defendant who forced into that SUV with a gun. From one of the defendant's chiefs of staff and other personal assistants. They will tell you they worked punishing hours and days for the defendant, at times without any sleep. They will tell you how the defendant ordered them to buy drugs for him, how they used all of the resources at his disposal to make sure the defendant always had everything he desired, how they were expected to keep quiet about what they saw and what they heard in the defendant's home. You will learn how some of these witnesses and victims, including Cassie, have already received financial settlements from the defendant, but these witnesses will tell you that they will trade any money from the defendant for not having been abused. You will also hear from some of the escorts who participated in the freak-offs with Cassie and Jane. They will tell you how the defendant directed the sexual activity between the escorts and Cassie or Jane, down to the details of how they touched each other and the specific sex acts they performed, all while the defendant filmed it. You will even hear from an escort who saw the defendant assault Cassie and drag her by her hair during the freak-off. In addition to these witnesses, you will see documents that prove the defendant's crimes. You'll see records from the hotel the car service, the airlines, showing the dates and locations when the escorts and women traveled to meet the defendant for freak-offs. You will see records of the physical damage to the defendant and his freak-off caused, the hotel rooms where he stayed. You'll see dozens and dozens of text messages about freak-offs, including messages from the defendant to his staff asking for more cash to pay the escorts, where the defendants tell Cassie what drugs to take when before a freak-off, and then messages to Jane, from Jane to the defendant, telling him over and over again that she did not want to do a freak off. You will see videos of some of the freak offs, and the videos the defendant used to blackmail Cassie, and other blackmail videos that he used against Jane to capture just small parts of these days-long performances. In them, you can hear the defendant providing directions to Cassie and to Jane, and you will see Cassie and Jane do exactly what the defendant tells them to do. You will see them put on a performance high on ecstasy where they pretend to enjoy themselves because that's what the defendant said he wanted to see. You will see for yourself the defendant's violence in its aftermath. You will see a video capturing the defendant's brutality beating Cassie during a freak-off in an LA hotel, and you will see photos of Cassie and her injuries from the defendant's assault he inflicted on her. You will see photos of the damages of the defendant when he kicked in 4 doors at Jane's room. You will see videos of Jane with bruising on her face days after the defendant attacked and forced her to do a freak-off. Not even a year ago, you will see for yourself the defendant had in his home in March 2024 when they searched guns, the defendant's so-called med bag full of illegal drugs and freak-off supplies like lubricant, platform high heels. Finally, you will see and hear evidence of how the defendant and his inner circle worked to keep the reputation and his power intact for all those years. You will see the agreement signed by the hotel security guard barring him from speaking about the $100,000 that the defendant paid him for the hotel security video. You will hear recordings of the phone calls when the defendant called Jane after Cassie had filed the lawsuit. You will hear him try to manipulate Jane into saying she wanted to have freak-offs. You will hear him interrupt Jane when she pushes back, and you will hear the defendant thinly veil references to continuing to pay for Jane's home in exchange for her silence. You will see the text messages the defendant sent to his chief of staff right after talking to Jane to make sure that Jane's rent would still be paid on time, and the evidence will come in piece by piece. And it won't always come in chronological order, but by the end of this trial, when you've seen and heard all of the evidence, you will see how it all fits together, and you will see how it proves the defendant led and controlled an enterprise that enabled him and others working for him to commit many crimes. How it proves that he forced and coerced Cassie and Jane into sex with male escorts, including by having them travel to other states and countries so that the sex acts could happen. And you will see how all these crimes in the empire of the defendant controlled were designed to fulfill his sexual desires, to protect his reputation, and to keep his power. At the end of this trial, we will have an opportunity to speak with you again. But between now and then, I ask that you do 3 things. First, please pay attention. Pay close attention to the evidence. Second, please follow the judge's instructions on the law. And third, please use and trust your common sense. If you do all of that, you will reach the only verdict that is consistent with the law and the evidence in this case, that the defendant, Sean Combs, is guilty. This is a defense opening statement performed by Teeny Garagos. Sean Combs is a complicated man, but this is not a complicated case. This is a case about love, jealousy, infidelity, and money. This case is about voluntary adult choices made by capable adults in consensual relationships. This case is about those real life relationships, and the government is trying to turn those relationships into a racketeering case, a prostitution case, a sex trafficking case, and it will not work. Let's start with the basics. The most important thing in this courtroom are you and him at a time when everything in government can feel so uncertain. One thing has remained certain, the same in our justice system, and that is that standing between all of us and a criminal conviction is a jury of our peers. That is you. You will hear the evidence and you will get the truth and you will see the witnesses and evaluate them one by one. And finally, the story about this case can finally come out. Why do I say that? I say that because this case is not about what you've heard on the news or read in the news or what you've seen on social media for the past year and a half. This case is not about what civil attorneys are looking for a payday or trying to make my client out to be there. There has been a tremendous amount of noise around this case for the past year. And it is time to cancel that noise and hear and see the evidence that will be presented in this courtroom. And it will be crystal clear. The story of Sean Combs is a fascinating one, but it is a human one. We are going to tell you his story over the next 2 months. And you will learn that he is a man who grew up here in New York City, in Harlem, who came from little but built groundbreaking, lawful businesses. You will hear that he is a wealthy individual, but know that the evidence will show that nobody he made nobody gave him money, that he worked for it. No one gave him a dime. And it will show that he made every single dollar. He recreated a culture and produced music that I believe you will hear change this generation. And I believe that the evidence is going to show that this ingenuity is what drew people to Mr. Combs. Witnesses will share with you that Mr. Combs is a fascinating person and that the people are drawn to him. Yes, he is famous. Yes, he is wealthy. And that's certainly part of it. But he was charismatic and magnetic and larger than life. If you had any interest in climbing the social ladder at that time and being involved in the music industry, the apparel industry, the spirits industry, attending his legendary parties, you wanted to be around Sean Combs. You wanted to be around him because of the benefits that came along with being with him. As you listen to this evidence in this case, try to remember why that matters. Try to remember why people stay around him and why it matters. I expect it will matter to you as the jury because he gave people opportunities. He gave people chances to work at his companies. He believed that he had a vision that few others had. And for the most part, I believe the evidence will show you that they loved him. I don't think that the witnesses will tell you. They always liked what he did or how he behaved because the real-time text messages that you will review in this case show that people really loved him. And they believe that by being with Sean Combs, they were part of something special. So by now you've heard the government say a lot of things about my client. It's time to introduce you to him. His name is Sean Combs. You may have heard him by Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, Puff Diddy, Puffy Diddy. But standing in this courtroom at 55 years, is the same place that he was born and raised. He's going by the same name he was born with, Sean Combs. My name is Teeny Garagos, and I'm one of the attorneys honored to represent him. The government started their opening statements by telling you this about a 20-year racketeering influence corruption organization enterprise that he committed with his apparent trusted circle. The only people in this courtroom who will tell you that they participated in, knew about, or came to an agreement to participate in a racketeering enterprise are the prosecutors. Not one witness will get into this courtroom and will take that witness stand and tell you that they are a part of any racketeering influence corruption organization act, or that the reason is simple. There was not one you heard that the government tried to say the enterprise that he used his lawful businesses to feed every desire, including sexual ones. This case is about Sean Combs' private personal sex life, which has nothing to do with his lawful businesses. The government has no place here in this man's private bedroom. The government can say over and over again that this is not about his private sex life, but the evidence will show you that it is the people who will come into this courtroom and testify, or the people who know about a racketeering enterprise, and those people will say that they knew nothing about that any enterprise. That is because these hardworking individuals were either doing their jobs as personal assistants or as top executives running a successful business. These are individuals educated at places from Harvard to Howard University. The prosecution will bring in those same employees and others into this courtroom and have them testify that Sean Combs has a temper, and when he drank or when he did the wrong drugs, he would get violent. My client is not proud of that, but it is one of the many things that we are going to own and fully admit right up front at this trial. Sean has a bad temper. Sometimes he gets so angry or so jealous that he's out of control. You will see evidence and you will hear some testimony that does not portray my client in a good light. You will hear you will see some text messages, some voice notes, and some witness testimony that will make you think, I don't think this is a great guy. I don't like how he just lied to his girlfriends. I don't like the things he just said in that text message. I want to tell you now, there may be multiple points at this trial where you think, I think he's a jerk. I think he is kind of mean, but he is not charged with being mean. He is not charged with being a jerk. He's charged with running a racketeering enterprise. And though there was violence that you're going to hear about, you already have that violence. You already know that violence is not a part of any RICO, that violence is not connected to sex trafficking, and that violence is not prostitution. There was a name in criminal law for the violence that we will hear about. And we will see at this trial, it is called domestic violence. It is called assault. Domestic violence is a very serious matter. I want to say it now. It is bad. It is a bad illegal problem. And it is something the law addresses. We take full responsibility that there was domestic violence in this case. Domestic violence is not sex trafficking. I want to say it again. Domestic violence is not sex trafficking. Had he been charged with domestic violence, had he been charged with assault, we would not be here right now. We would not be sitting through an 8-week trial. However, he has been charged with different crimes: sex trafficking, prostitution, racketeering. These are federal crimes with their different statutes. They charge different elements, and he is simply not guilty of those crimes. One of the central themes of my statement to you will be personal accountability. And personal accountability, as a trial goes on, we will see that each witnesses, we are going to take on that ourselves. We will not shy away from the things that Mr. Combs did, but we will not deny his personal responsibility or own the things we did not do. We are telling you right now that he is physical and that he is a drug user. And I'm telling you that he had a bit of a different sex life. For example, you have not heard any evidence in this case, but the prosecutors already told you about lubricant, and you may know of his love of baby oil, but that is not a federal crime. Is that a federal crime? No. You will hear that he got IVs after ingesting drugs. Is that a federal crime? No. He will be responsible. He will be accountable for the things he did. But we will fight for his freedom throughout the next 8 weeks for what he did not do. And he cannot be the only person in this case who accepts personal responsibility and accountability for his actions. The alleged victims who will testify in this case are capable, strong, adult women. They were all getting something each of them wanted from him and from being in a romantic relationship with him. And these adults, capable, strong women, will have to take some level of personal responsibility for their lives. That same personal responsibility he is going to take on for his. When any person in life makes an adult choice, that is a free choice. A free choice has pros, it has cons. You may think that there are better choices. You may think that there are worse choices, but that does not eliminate the personal responsibility behind those choices. And each of the women you will hear, they all had the personal responsibility and the freedom to make the choices that they made. You will hear from these women. You will see these women. You will meet these women. They will sit in that witness chair a few feet away, and you will evaluate them for yourself. You will see that they are capable. You will see that they are strong. And then you will see that they made free choices every single day for years. As you are listening to the evidence, you will listen to them testify. I want you to ask yourself, what are all the ways that this individual had the ability to make that choice? Ask yourself, what are they getting from being with Sean Combs? They are not with him because they are stuck or because they are without a choice. The government will try to show you that Sean Combs is the only one getting something from each of the alleged victims who testified in this case. But with each of these individuals, ask yourself, what is this person getting? They are with him or they are working for him because they are getting something they want from being with him. Now, with each person, that something may be different, and it usually is. But with each person, they are all getting something. As you listen to this evidence, watch closely to the role that jealousy plays. We have talked to you, both of us, already about jealousy and how it is persuasive. and present in every single relationship. But I want to let you know that it drives a lot of the choices that the alleged victims made here. Combs is one of those men that I'll submit to you, we all know the evidence is going to show that he is someone who never married, but he always needed to have a woman around him. He is a man, he has a mini woman. He has 7 children by 4 different women. And he is the kind of guy who is always in a relationship. In fact, he's always in multiple relationships. But critically, he was not always honest about that fact. And you'll find that even when women knew he was in multiple relationships, this would drive primal jealousy in people. It would drive a lot of the choices you are going to see in this case. You are also going to see that Sean Combs is extremely jealous. You might think that is hypocritical. You might not like it, but you're going to see that he's also extremely jealous. So as you're listening to the evidence and you're evaluating the testimony, ask yourself, what is causing the fight? The answer is without exception jealousy or drugs. The hitting the things, we're going to take responsibility for it. It's typically because of jealousy or drug use. The role of jealousy here is critical and it's pervasive. The evidence will show you that over the course of 20 years, we will examine in this courtroom, we'll see the same women over and over. They remain in multi-year relationships with him. And I believe you'll pretty much know about every relationship he's had over the past 20 years. And again, that's whether this is an employee or a girlfriend. You will pretty much know about every girlfriend he has had. You will see that these women are strong and capable, and they were in love with him. And you will see that breach of trust, infidelity, jealousy is what drove the domestic violence. You will hear about it. You will see that alcohol and drugs played a major role in his temper. The evidence is going to show you a very flawed individual, but it will not show you a racketeer, a sex trafficker, or someone transporting for prostitution. So as we've said, you're going to hear from 2 women, Cassie and Jane. This case is in large part about his sexual relationships with 2 women, and you're going to hear that they went to private hotels to engage in what I expect some witnesses in this case to call a swingers lifestyle, which is essentially just a fancier term for threesomes by adults consenting. Sometimes Combs partook in the sex while his girlfriend and the male escort, and the other times he watched while the male escort was having sex with his girlfriend. You heard the government call these freak-offs. I expect you will hear they also call them parties and entertainment. You will hear from both Cassie and Jane about these nights. They will testify about their relationship, and you will hear things that should never be heard in a federal courtroom. I think you've already heard things that will make you uncomfortable at first. That he liked to watch this. You might hear about his kinky sex or his preferences for sex that might make you uncomfortable. And it may not be what you like to do in your bedroom, but you're not here to judge him for his sexual preferences. You're not here to judge him. For all purposes, you are here to evaluate whether the government can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they actually charged him with what they actually charged him with. They cannot. Also, you've heard that in his relationships with both Cassie and Jane, he bought them things. Yes, like every relationship, they got things from their boyfriends. Here, a wealthier rapper paid for their housing. He paid for Cassie's car, and he gave them money. These are nice houses that he paid for. It was a nice car that Cassie drove, and they were nice vacations on private planes. Because he is a wealthy individual, these were vacations that they took together as couples. And as I've said, like every relationship, there was jealousy and there were flaws. But as you evaluate the evidence in this case, remember that he is not charged with being a flawed individual or having a flawed relationship. A flawed relationship. They did not stay with him over and over again because of fraud, force, or coercion. The evidence in this case will show you that over and over again, day after day, these women fought to be in a relationship, fought to do what they wanted to do in consent, wanted to do in consensual adult relationships. This case started with Cassie, so I think it's best for me to start there. I expect you will hear from her this week. She will sit in this witness box and she will tell you about her 11-year relationship with Sean Combs. You heard they met when she was an up-and-coming artist. What you didn't hear is that she had a boyfriend at the time, and he was in a very public relationship with the mother of his 4 children named Kim Porter. After the two fell in love and started dating, she broke up with her producer boyfriend, but Combs, for his part, did not break up with Kim. He remained in a public relationship with her, and that is something that caused extreme jealousy with Cassie. He continued that relationship with Kim Porter until her tragic, untimely death from pneumonia in 2018. It is important because you will look at the evidence, and as you evaluate Cassie and Combs' relationship, you will see that their fights, their cheating, their jealousy, it typically surrounded his cheating or it surrounded hers. This is something that plagued their relationship until the very last day. The evidence will show you that he was extremely jealous of Cassie. Actually, or perceived infidelities, and she was uncontrollably jealous of his. This led to a toxic relationship between the two that I expect the evidence will show. Deeply, deeply loved each other. Both perhaps they did not always show love to another the way you would show love to your partner. But they were in a relationship, and she was not being trafficked. You will see that over and over again in this decade-long relationship, these two fought about his inability to remain faithful. I expect Cassie to tell you about the jealousy of Kim Porter and another girlfriend that he started dating in 2014 named Gina. This jealousy is something that plagued their relationship even the day of the Intercontinental video in the elevator bank that much of you told us during jury selection you saw. That day, unfortunately, jealousy was on full display. And in combination with the bag drugs that I expect Cassie to testify that Combs took, it led to domestic violence. In the elevator bank, this assault happened almost 10 years ago, on March 5th, 2016. I expect that we're all going to see this video many, many times throughout this trial. You're going to see it later today, and I expect you will see many more times throughout this week. You're going to see it a lot, but I want to start by saying 2 things. First, what Combs did to Cassie in this tape is indefensible. It's horrible. It's dehumanizing. It's violent. It's virtually every bad word you can think of. And while it is dehumanizing and violent and terrible, and the second most important thing is that it is not evidence of sex trafficking. It is evidence of domestic violence. You will see that it is also evidence of the central theme in this case, which is jealousy. That is what this videotape shows. As you watch it later today, and as you watch it throughout this week, I want you to look for two things. The first part is Cassie walking out of the hotel room, walking down the hallway. She's carrying two bags, and you will see that she makes it to the elevator. And then you will see Combs come down the hallway wearing only a towel. He pulls Cassie by the hoodie, and then she falls to the floor. He kicks her in the backside and stomps on the back of her leg. And he starts to drag her by her hoodie back to the hotel room. You will see him walk away momentarily with her bags. And you will see this, and then he comes back around. He walks towards her, and she is kind of on the left of the part of the screen. When he comes towards her, he has nothing in his hands. And then he walks away from her. You will see an illuminated phone in his hands. He wanted his phone, and he got it. Please understand that this video is overwhelming evidence of domestic violence, overwhelmingly evidence that the domestic violence is over a phone and not because of sex trafficking. What would cause a fight about a phone? We can all use our life experiences to show us that phones keep the secrets of infidelities, and you will hear that there. There was not another fight, even later that year, again, about a phone. Not justifying the assault, but not by a long shot. But I'm putting into proper context because you will see that as soon as he gets the phone, he sits down, he's visibly disgusted, he's broken a vase, he's thrown flowers, and he stayed away in the second video. The video has a second part. Cassie calls security from the hotel phone. The security officer comes to the floor, and I expect you will hear from him later today. Combs is sitting in a chair, slumped over. He's holding his head in his hands, and the security officer tells them to leave the public area of the hotel where they are making the commotion. You will see Cassie turn to Combs and gesture for her to pay attention to the words that I think you will hear her say to him, which is, "Get back in the room." Two parts, both of them important, and both of them important to show that Combs assaulted Cassie. But you can't stop there because he is not charged with assault. It is because of sex trafficking, as the government is going to argue to you. Or is it because of something else? I expect the evidence, even just this week, will show you that the fight was over a phone. These two stayed together for more than 2 years after the incident. And to understand how and to understand why is to understand how this relationship ended. You'll hear that even in 2018, these two were fighting to stay together. But the evidence will show you that in the summer of that year of 2018, she woke up to a gossip site that showed a photo of Combs and Gina, the same woman who he had started having an affair with, or a relationship with, I should say, walking out of the Standard Hotel together. Cassie could not come back from it. She could not give him another chance. And instead she made the choice, as she often did when she caught him in public with Gina, to break up with him and to date another man. For Cassie, she made a choice every single day for years. A choice to stay with him, a choice to fight for him, because for 11 years, that was the better choice. That was her preferred choice. And so she made the choice to stay with him until one day she decided she was going to break up with him because that was her preferred choice. So it's important for you to remember that as you evaluate the evidence, because she was not coerced to continue or engage in this sex life with Sean Combs. When she made the decision to leave, there was no repercussions. As the government hinted, she made the choice to leave, she communicated it to him, and she ran into the arms of another man, a physical trainer who Combs had hired to train her. So I will ask you, ladies and gentlemen, pay close attention to the messages, the real-time communication between these two individuals, and the messages surrounding their breakup. Does this Combs release the video footage to the government was talking about? No, he doesn't. You will hear the government raided two of his homes. You have already heard that over a year ago. They seized countless electronic devices. The only freak-off videos you will see or hear about at this trial come from her devices that she kept for 5 years. So when the government talks about power and control, who had the power? Who had the control? The government did not find any freak-off videos with Cassie on those devices. And so going back during the time of Cassie and Combs' breakup, Cassie already dating her now husband she was with him for months as she is breaking up with Combs, all while telling Combs she still loves him. And then in November of 2018, Kim Porter tragically passes away from pneumonia. Knowing that Combs would be distraught and wanting to be there for him, she did everything she could to be there. She came to the memorial service at his home. She flew to Kim's home state of Georgia to be with him at the funeral. So don't lose sight of the fact that amidst the breakup, all the way to the end of 2018, she flew to a funeral service to be there for him, and she supported him and his family during this trying time of their lives. And that service at their home comes to a group of loved ones and former employees and others, and to many people on social media who were paying respects, said, and I quote, "Kim was my soulmate." In Cassie's presence for everyone to hear, he said, "She was my soulmate." The end of the relationship between Cassie and Combs is important, and I want you to focus on the evidence of how and why it ended. When Combs publicly said Kim Porter was his soulmate, to all the people around him who were there, for the first time, maybe ever, Cassie realized that all the things she would not be. I expect many witnesses at this trial to tell you that she wanted to be Combs' wife. I expect even she may tell you that that's what she spent 11 years trying to get. And in a way, it became clear to Cassie, she was never going to be that. And if she was never going to be Combs' wife, if she was never going to be the love of his life, then she would leave. And that is what she did, on her terms, her choice, for reasons that for her were the right reasons. This is where bringing in personal experiences to the jury matters. This is something we've all been through in life. At one event, you can point to where you can say that is when I knew it was over. Because that is what this was for her. Because this was a relationship, although toxic, although toxic at times, like every other relationship, it was not based on coercion. It was not based on force. At a certain point, you know you're not going to get what you need from that other person, and you leave. After Kim's funeral, they never saw each other again. The very first time that this former couple will see each other again after 6.5 years of a breakup is in this courtroom later today or tomorrow. We are all going to witness their closure. And that is because she moved on with her life and he moved on with his. You will see that she married the trainer. She had 2 children with them, and she's pregnant with her 3rd. And Combs also moved on with his life. As you listen to her testimony and as you read her messages closely, Evaluate what Combs intended at the time. Evaluate what he understood about what she wanted during those 11 years that they spent together. What he understood, I expect the messages to show you, was that she was a willing participant in their sex life. That it was a voluntary adult choice by two capable adults. What Cassie may testify to you this week, 6 years after the breakup, is not a match for the real-time evidence that you will have. The real-time text messages I urge you to read. Evaluate his intent, which is the only thing that matters. Here the government also talked to you a lot about Jane. She is the other woman. The government alleges Combs sex trafficked her. She was his girlfriend of 3 years, and she comes into his life several years after Cassie breakup. I think you will find the evidence is a little bit different in 2020 and 2021 than he was when he was dating Cassie. And I think the most important reason you will see that is that he was more upfront about his dating life. Rather than saying he was only dating one person, he was very upfront with Jane. And I expect her to tell you that he was dating multiple different women. However, as I start my opening statement, this did not stop the jealousy. Jane's relationship with Combs was plagued by jealousy. Their relationship was not the 11-year public romance that Combs and Cassie had. The problem is that Jane wished that it was. The government told you that their relationship was not public. There were many different reasons why that was. And so after a period of time, the relationship became primarily sexual. Jane is also older than Cassie was when she started dating him. She was living her own life in a different state, raising her child. She is a capable, strong adult woman. And you're going to hear, as I expect that you've already heard, that pretty soon after the relationship with Combs started, he brought up the idea of whether she would want to have sex with another man. Again, like a consensual threesome. And Combs would watch, and she agreed, and they went to a private hotel away from his employees, away from his family, and I expect that she will testify that she enjoyed that night, and she laid down on the couch after and said to herself, like, wow, I can't believe I just did that. And you will see that Combs really began to love those hotel nights with her. And I expect that she will testify that she will begin to do everything possible to make these nights incredible for Combs. That included finding the best male entertainer to join them, to wear the outfits that he would find the sexiest, saying all the things during the nights that would excite him. I would expect that she would testify she did this because she loved him. She was desperate to spend time with him, to be with him, and ultimately to give him something that none of the other girlfriends that he was dating at the time were giving him. She will tell you that she tried many times to change the tenor of their relationship from one of a purely sexual nature, something maybe deeper, more meaningful. I'm not sure exactly how she will put that to you, but she will testify that it always came back to what they will call parties, which were these nights in hotel rooms. And the evidence will show you that she did it over and over again for 3 years because she made the choice. And this became their time together. This became their sex life. And I expect that she will testify that she realized that if she didn't have these hotel nights with Combs, that they may never get their alone time together, which is what she so deeply craved. I expect she will tell you that she kept coming back over and over again because she did it for the affection. She did it for the love, for the cuddle. And maybe she knew it would make him happy. And she wanted more than anything to make him happy. She was unable to resist him emotionally, and her desire to be with him outweighed all other considerations of hers. The government told you about a phone call they had in November of 2023. I expect the evidence will show you that even after this phone call, She continued to fly out to see him many more times and continue willingly to engage in these nights. The evidence is going to show you a toxic and dysfunctional relationship between these two individuals. And you may think for yourself, wow, he is a really bad boyfriend. But the evidence is going to show you that she's a capable, strong woman who willingly engaged in their sex life so they could spend time together. And that is simply not sex trafficking. I expect her to testify that she was a willing participant, and being a willing participant in your own sex life is not sex trafficking. I expect her to also testify that there were nights she engaged in the sex because she hoped she could turn their relationship from one of a sexual relationship into something more. She will testify that if she walked away, she would have lost him, and that is not something she was willing to do. And as I said to you, you will see her jealousy on full display in this trial. You will see that she was willing to engage in these nights with Combs, and then she would be on social media after, and she would see him with another one of his girlfriends, either out to dinner or traveling, and she would send messages with regrets after these. They're born out of jealousy, which was the root of their trouble. And regret does not mean that she was coerced. Her jealousy drove her to make the moves that she made. And as I said, every single witness in this case had free choice to make the choices they made. The jealousy of other women in Combs' life was one of her seeing the other women that he would be on social media posts with or otherwise, drove her to try to be in first place, and made her more desirous of their time together. Also told you about a night born out of jealousy that you've already heard that he hit her back. Born out of jealousy, if you heard that he also hit her back. But what you didn't hear was that the start of the fight was that she was overcome by jealousy that night. She slammed his head down on the kitchen table, and this is how the fight started. I do not want to justify the assault, but I simply am here to tell you that the evidence will show you that it starts because she slams his head on the kitchen counter. And you are also going to hear that less than a month, or approximately a month after their assault, an incident of domestic violence at her home, she flew to Combs' home in Miami. She caught an escort, and she had what I expect her to say was one of the best hotel nights that she'd had with one of their regular escorts. Now, during the testimony of both Cassie and Jane, I expect the government is going to put in a bunch of videotapes of so-called freak-offs or hotel nights, of Wild King nights, or however you would like to call them, into evidence. These videos depict what we've been telling you about Sean Combs, one of his girlfriends and a man. These videos we believe are powerful evidence that the sexual conduct in this case was consensual and not based on coercion. But I want to say one thing to you. Now, some of you may find them hard to watch, not because they are violent, not because they are non-consensual, but because they were never meant to be seen by people outside of the room. They are, in one word, intimate, and they were always meant to remain that way. The reason these videos will be seen by you is because the government has chosen to take possession of these videos and put them into evidence in a federal courtroom. Now, playing these videos will feel invasive, but the government has charged him with sex trafficking, and the evidence of the alleged sex trafficking is on these videos. This is why you will have to see them. And you may hear about other women the government told you about, someone named Mia, for example. I urge you to pay attention to these other women's real-time communication with Combs. Ask yourself, why are they making this allegation now? What is their motive? You will conclude, like you will with every other witness in this case, that everybody who testifies has a motive. With Mia, for example, I ask you to evaluate her motives when you listen to her testimony. What are the reasons she's saying what she might be saying now that she has never said before? And certainly never said when she first started cooperating with the government. This is someone you should evaluate her messages carefully. Ones of the unbelievable love for Combs. Throughout her employment, you're also going to hear from several other past employees of his. They will try to paint a picture for you of a hostile workplace. And as I've said with nearly every single witness in this case, when it comes to these people testify, ask yourself, why did nobody, if they were so scared, if they were, and if was such a hostile environment, ever call the police? Why not? I expect the evidence will show you that the testimony against these former bosses, for many, not all, is vindictive, or they are being subpoenaed to give it, like every other witness. Ask yourself, what is the something that is the reason that they stayed? You will find with every single person they have a something. So when you hear from the witnesses who testify here, who will tell you that they were victimized, and you ask yourself, what is their motive? For many of them, the answer is simple: money. This criminal case started because of Cassie. Not because she went to law enforcement with her allegations, but because she filed a public lawsuit against Combs in November of 2023. At this time, she was having financial trouble and living in her parents' modest home in Connecticut with her family. Rather than go to law enforcement about what had allegedly happened to her, she went to a civil lawyer who is here today. I expected this trial from nearly every witness that you hear. They will tell you that instead of going to law enforcement after either their employment ended, they went to a civil lawyer for a money grab. After either their employment ended, the alleged victims went to a civil lawyer for a money grab. They will claim that they were so afraid of this man that they could not go to the police because he was so powerful, but they were not so afraid that they could not go to the civil lawyers to make money demands against him, and demands for unbelievable amounts of money, more than any of us have ever made. Cassie, for example, will tell you that she first made a demand on Combs for $30 million. Another witness will tell you that in a breach of contract case, she made a demand for $22 million. And as you listen to these witnesses, and then there will be many, as the prosecutor told you, who made civil demands against him, I want you to ask yourself, how many millions of reasons does this witness swearing to tell the truth and nothing but the truth have to lie? How many hundreds of thousands of reasons does this witness swearing to tell the truth and nothing but the truth have to lie? You will really believe these people who have demanded an unimaginable amount of money from Mr. Combs would have traded all of that to have not been abused. Because if that were the case, I submit to you, you will consider, why did they never go to law enforcement? So in closing, the evidence will be framed to prove the government that they attempt to prove Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act charged 2 sex trafficking charges, 2 prostitution counts. The evidence you will hear at this trial will not make out any of them. The conspiracy charge is that Combs allegedly committed 2 acts of kidnapping, 1 count of arson, and 1 count of bribery of obstruction of justice, forced labor, and drug trafficking. I'm going to take these briefly in turn, and then I'm going to ask you to evaluate the evidence by the witnesses who will testify about these acts. First, he did not commit any of these acts. In terms of the alleged bribery and the obstruction of justice, this relates to the Intercontinental Hotel incident that we've talked about this morning. And you will hear, as you already did, that he paid money to a security guard at the Intercontinental so the footage would go away. This was solely related to preventing bad publicity for both Combs and Cassie. It had nothing to do with obstructing a law enforcement investigation. No law enforcement investigation existed, period. That is a requirement. And so the evidence will show you he simply did not commit those acts. Okay, as to the kidnapping and the arson, I submit to you that you are not going to find there are any kidnappings. And he was simply not involved in the alleged arson. The government told you that the kidnapping was related to one employee who I am telling you the evidence will show worked for Combs for almost a decade. As you will listen to her testimony and evaluate that this person actually kidnapped, I expect the evidence is going to show that even after the criminal investigation into Combs started, she asked to work for him again 12 years after her employment ended. 12 years after she claimed she had been kidnapped the last time. Now more than a decade after these kidnapping acts, and so the evidence is going to show you that he simply did not commit them. As to the drug trafficking, I submit the evidence is going to show you that the drugs are personal use drugs for him and at times the women he was with. Those drugs have nothing to do with an enterprise, and to the forced labor, you will see that Combs worked hard. His employees worked hard, and they are going to do something great and novel for his lawful businesses. It is not a forced being there. There was an adult-free choice, like everything in this case. Second, the RICO conspiracy requires a group effort, even if the group is 2 people, and there will be no evidence of that. So as you are listening to the evidence, ask yourself, who is Combs actually conspiring with to violate the Racketeering Influence Corruption Organization Act? The answer will be no one. Finally, the last of the charges I will talk to you about are the 2 counts that charged him with causing interstate travel for the purposes of prostitution. For him to be guilty, I expect the judge will tell you that he had to internationally engage in what he knows to be prostitution. What the evidence is going to be is that he was paying different men for their time and experience. Think about the pornography industry, for example. Actors in pornographic movies are paid for their time, and generally they have sex. Otherwise, it wouldn't be pornography. You will also hear about many companies. I expect you'll hear from one later today called Hunkomania, a company called Cowboys for Angels that advertise online across the country where you can pay money for time and an experience. These escort companies are common and they do not advertise themselves as money for sex. They advertise themselves as money for time and money for an experience, and that is what Sean Combs was doing. He was paying money for that experience. So in closing, I ask you again to listen carefully to all the evidence. You are not here to judge or impose your moral beliefs on this man. You are here as a jury of his peers to determine whether the government can meet its burden of proof of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed these crimes. When you hear the evidence, when you go back into the jury room and evaluate the evidence in light of the crimes that are actually charged here, you will return with the only verdict that the evidence demands, that he is not guilty of these crimes. Wow. I know that was a lot to get through, but it was really important to me that I laid the foundation for this trial so that we can pay specific attention to the prosecution side and the defense side, and we can gather our evidence and really see what's going on in this trial. Thank you so much for joining me. Feel free to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I will see you guys again soon in my next video. Bye.